northern Minnesota, June of the year 1961. The forest air was brittle with pine resin, the kind that clings to the inside of your nose and stays with you longer than you'd like. Bodomor Lake lay quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Its surface was flat, almost metallic in its stillness, reflecting the gray, overcast sky with unnatural precision. It was the kind of lake that seemed to listen. On the eastern shore, beneath a crooked patch of red pine, a group of 3 canvas tents stood between the trees. The campers, 4 young men from Idaho, had arrived 2 days earlier, their journey documented only by a fuel receipt from a station outside Bemidji. They were here to fish, to drink, and to lose themselves in the wilderness, far from the noise of civilization. Among them was 22-year-old Freddie Walder, a quiet, introspective man with a narrow build and a cautious demeanor. According to the others, Freddie had a tendency to drift into long silences, his eyes fixed on something far away, though nothing ever seemed to be there. He vanished on the evening of June 16th. That day had passed like any other. Breakfast of dried meat and weak coffee, followed by hours along the rocky shoreline, casting lines into the cold, black water. They hadn't caught much. The sky had been a dull iron all day, the kind that presses on your head like a heavy thought. Around 7 in the evening, Freddie told the group he was going to relieve himself up the ridge behind the campsite. He carried no bag, no flashlight, and wore only a flannel shirt and jeans. That was the last time anyone saw him for 7 full days. The search began the next morning, once it became clear Freddie hadn't returned to his sleeping bag. His friends, initially annoyed, assumed he'd wandered off in the dark and gotten lost. But by mid-morning, that irritation turned into a low-level dread. The forest up there isn't forgiving. Thick undergrowth, sudden drops, and sinkholes hidden under moss. They searched for hours. When they reported the disappearance to the local authorities near Ely, a search and rescue team was deployed by dusk. Over the next 3 days, more than 50 volunteers combed a 20-mile radius around the campsite. They brought dogs, aerial maps, and a low-flying spotter plane from Duluth. Not a trace was found. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sounds in the night. The underbrush looked undisturbed, as if Freddie had never existed to begin with. The weather was stable. No rain to wash away signs, no evidence of animal predation. It was as though he had stepped sideways into a place outside of nature. On the 7th day, June 23rd, just after sunrise, Freddie Walder returned. He was found walking along County Road 19, 15 miles south of the lake, barefoot and dazed. His shirt was unbuttoned, streaked with dirt and dried pine sap. His hair was matted with sweat. A truck driver spotted him and called the sheriff's office. Freddie was silent for the first several minutes, responding only to direct questions with short, confused answers. When brought to the hospital in Two Harbors, he asked for water, then sat still for nearly an hour, staring at his hands. The attending physician, Dr. Marvin Hulbrecht, noted no visible injuries. Freddie had lost weight, approximately 6 pounds, but showed no signs of malnutrition or exposure. No bruises, no cuts, no burns, insect bites, or even sun damage. His vitals were stable. When asked where he'd been, Freddie simply said, "I was inside the war. There wasn't time there." That sentence was recorded by the attending nurse, who later remarked that his voice had a strange calmness, as though he were recounting something long past, not recent. The official report lists his disappearance as undetermined circumstance. No charges were filed. No follow-up investigation was conducted by the sheriff's office beyond the standard report. Freddie's friends, when later interviewed, appeared visibly shaken. One of them, Daniel Cray, admitted he no longer camped or even hiked in wooded areas. "Something was wrong up there," he said in a recorded statement. "We heard it wasn't an animal. We thought it was trees creaking, but the trees weren't moving." Over the following weeks, several newspapers ran brief mentions of the wilderness disappearance mystery, though none stayed on the story for long. One article in the St. Paul Sentinel speculated that Freddie may have suffered a temporary psychotic break and wandered through the woods in a fugue state. That theory, however, failed to account for the unbroken vegetation and lack of physical trauma. A local historian, Walter Genrich, who had lived in Lake County since 1927, believed something else might be at play. He had spent the past decade collecting unexplained reports from hunters, rangers, and trappers. In his personal archive, an old filing cabinet in his basement, were dozens of accounts of time slips, frozen air, and missing hours around Bodomor Lake and its surroundings. According to Genrich, Freddie Walder was not the first to disappear near the lake, nor the first to mention a war. In October of 1948, two loggers reported hearing a soft humming like metal vibrating, shortly before both blacked out and awoke 5 hours later, lying on opposite ends of the clearing. No medical explanation was given, and then there was the matter of the Institute. 3 miles northeast of Bodomor Lake, hidden behind an overgrowth of cedar and underbrush, lies the concrete skeleton of a former government research outpost. No nameplate, no official records, just a collapsed radio tower and sealed underground access hatch. Locals refer to it simply as the station. Built sometime in the early 1950s, its original function remains classified. However, Genrich had acquired a decommissioning document through a contact in the National Archives. The station was listed under Project Grackle. Purpose: sensory response trials under field isolation conditions. One memo, dated August 2, 1955, referenced temporal latency aberrations in magnetic corridors. The language was vague, but the implications unsettling, especially when mapped over the coordinates of the Bodomor region, where intermittent fluctuations in compass readings had been recorded by surveyors for decades. As Freddie sat in the small hospital room in Two Harbors, he remained mostly silent, but once, and only once, he spoke a full sentence to the nurse who brought him his dinner. "There were no doors," he said, "only angles, but I couldn't see all of them at once." She asked what he meant. Freddie only blinked. "I think I was under the lake," he added, almost in a whisper, but it wasn't wet. He never elaborated again. In the weeks that followed, Freddie was released into the care of his family. He moved back to Boise and never publicly spoke of the incident again. Attempts to interview him over the next several years were unsuccessful. His family cited sensitive health reasons for declining comment, but the questions remained. What happened on June 16th? How does a man vanish without a trace, only to return days later, physically intact but mentally fragmented? Speaking of walls without time and places that defy the laws of space, the answer, if it exists, may lie beneath the trees of northern Minnesota. Or perhaps within the buried walls of a station long abandoned, where time, they said, could bend. The days following Freddie Walder's return were marked by a silence deeper than any that had preceded it. Officially, the matter was closed. The sheriff's report was filed. Freddie was labeled physically recovered. But in the nearby town of Lutsen, in the wooden-paneled booths of roadside diners and dimly lit general stores, the locals spoke in hushed tones. Something wasn't right. They had felt it for years. That strange hum in the trees when there was no wind. That heaviness in the air along the ridge east of the lake. The way animals sometimes refused to go near the shoreline. On June 29th, less than a week after Freddie's reappearance, a volunteer named Ruth Danziger arrived in town. She was not with the police or any federal agency. She was a research assistant from a small liberal arts college in St. Paul. Thin, bookish, with short-cut hair and heavy canvas boots, Ruth had heard about the disappearance from a passing reference in the Minneapolis Morning Tribune. She didn't believe in rumors or ghost stories. What caught her attention was the geographic notation in the original article. Bodomor Lake, near the Seagard Fault, a region known in specific geological circles for its erratic magnetic behavior. Ruth had been cataloging anomalies in compass deviation reports across the Great Lakes region, tracing patterns that didn't align with any known ore bodies or glacial deposits. Bodomor sat dead center in one such zone. She arrived with a map case, a barometer, and a magnetometer designed in 1958 by physicist Lester Linder. She did not alert the sheriff's office, nor did she inform the Forest Service of her fieldwork. She set up camp near the same ridge where Freddie had last been seen. That night, something strange occurred. At precisely 1:22 in the morning, the barometer dropped suddenly, but there was no change in wind or temperature. Ruth, awake and taking readings by lamplight, recorded a sharp shift in the magnetometer needle, 42 degrees west in under 3 seconds, then back again. No seismic activity was registered by nearby stations. The event lasted less than a minute, but for Ruth, it was confirmation. Something beneath the surface of that forest was moving, shifting, or perhaps pulsing. She remained there for 4 days. During that time, her field journal recorded 8 separate magnetic disturbances, all occurring between midnight and 3 in the morning. On the 3rd night, she noted a faint tonal vibration, like metal being bowed, she wrote. She also recorded what she described as a visual shimmer, a distortion in the air above a small clearing, visible for several seconds before dissipating. On the 5th day, she left. Her notes were never published. The college archives indicate her fieldwork was interrupted by a personal matter, and she transferred to a university in Oregon the following semester. The journal, however, was found in a box of unprocessed documents in a university storage room in 1972. It had never been catalogued. Meanwhile, back in Two Harbors, Freddie Walder began to draw maps. His family reported that he had taken to sketching late at night, using butcher paper and charcoal. The drawings were intricate, repeating geometric shapes that spiraled outward into non-Euclidean patterns. His mother, Edith Walder, showed one of the sketches to a local priest. The priest reportedly refused to keep it in the rectory, citing a disturbing presence that made him physically ill. The drawings ceased abruptly after August 5th. On that night, Freddie suffered what doctors later classified as a psychotic dissociative episode. He was found on the floor of the basement, clutching a section of soil in his hands, eyes open but unblinking. He was institutionalized for observation at St. Francis Asylum in Duluth for 90 days. While there, he spoke only once, during a psychological evaluation. "They had no mouths," he said, "but they told me things in pieces, things I shouldn't know." No further elaboration was recorded. What makes this detail significant is a forgotten report from March of 1959. 2 years earlier, a Forest Service ranger named Henry Bloxam filed an incident log after encountering a series of perfectly circular impressions near the southern edge of Bodomor Lake. The prints were 12 inches in diameter, spaced exactly 43 inches apart, and continued in a straight line for over 200 feet before vanishing into solid granite. The report was marked unsubstantiated and buried in a maintenance file. What ties Bloxam's account to Freddie Walder's case are the numbers. 43 inches apart. Freddie's mother later testified that in one of her son's drawings, he had repeatedly written the sequence 43, 1, 12 in different arrangements. It was never explained. After Freddie was discharged, he refused to return to the lake or to speak of it again. He burned the remaining sketches in the family fireplace. But neighbors noticed strange behavior, particularly in the early hours before dawn. Freddie would walk his backyard in concentric circles, muttering what sounded like phrases in another language, or no language at all. One neighbor, Albert Redke, claimed to have recorded the sounds from his window using a reel-to-reel machine. He said it picked up a low tonal hum on the tape, something not present in the environment at the time. That reel was lost in a garage fire in 1967, and Redke died shortly thereafter from a sudden cardiac arrest. Despite this, the interest in Bodomor did not die. By September, 2 amateur researchers from Winnipeg arrived in the area, claiming to be investigating acoustic properties of isolated geological formations. In reality, they were members of a short-lived scientific society known as the Fenland Study Group, which had an interest in regions of altered cognition. They published a single paper in late 1961 in which Bodomor Lake was referenced only by its coordinates. The paper noted intensified reactions during REM cycles when subjects were exposed to low-frequency field recordings from the region. No further publications followed. Both researchers left academia within a year. To this day, no comprehensive study has ever been conducted into the convergence of anomalies surrounding Bodomor Lake. Geological surveys list it as unremarkable. State records mention no hazardous zones, but those who live nearby, those whose families have been in the region since the logging camps of the 1930s, they know differently. There are places where the forest doesn't grow quite right, where animals fall silent, where machines flicker and the air itself feels warped as if it resists you. The kind of places where time, for a second, might forget itself. And there is always the wall. The idea of it recurs in Freddy's mutterings, in old trapper tales, in the low magnetic shifts recorded by forgotten instruments. A structure not of stone or steel, but of presence. Invisible, unyielding, and utterly indifferent to human understanding. What Freddy Walder touched, or what touched him, remains unknown. By October of 1961, the forest surrounding Bodomor Lake had returned to its usual stillness, at least on the surface. With the summer tourists gone and the temperature dropping, the region slipped into that quiet phase between seasons when time itself seems to hesitate. But in the background, threads were pulling tighter. The incident involving Freddy Walder had stirred something far beyond the borders of Lake County. On October the 12th, a letter was delivered by hand to the Duluth field office of the U.S. Geological Survey. It was addressed to Chief Cartographer Douglas M. Shaw, marked urgent, and bore no return address. Inside was a topographical survey of the Bodomor region, but altered. Several features not present on official government maps had been annotated in red pencil. A dry ravine west of the lake labeled Primary Axis, a granite shelf identified as Point of Rupture, and most notably, a circular zone just under 3 miles wide, ringed in symbols not found on any conventional geological notation. At the center, a single word had been written in block capitals, corridor. Shaw, a disciplined man with 27 years of federal service, initially dismissed it as a hoax. But curiosity overcame procedure. On October the 14th, he and a junior analyst, George Rumley, drove to the site with equipment and recording tools. What they found was not a corridor, not visibly at least, but the granite shelf marked on the map was indeed there. Smooth, wide, and oddly clean, as if washed by something not of weather or time. They set up instruments. Compasses wavered near the slab's edges. Theodolites lost alignment after 10 minutes. Rumley reported a sudden drop in sound. Not silence, but the sensation of all ambient noise being swallowed. Birds ceased. Wind stopped. Their voices felt muted, as if filtered through cotton. This lasted no more than 90 seconds, but both men later described the sensation as fundamentally wrong. That same week, a separate investigation, unofficial and unsanctioned, was being conducted in secret. Not far from the lake, in a dusty records annex in Hibbing, Minnesota, a retired electrical engineer named Gregory Kravitz was sorting through surplus documents for a local salvage contractor. Kravitz, a veteran of military communications projects from the late 40s, was one of only a few civilians in the state who had worked on classified signal compression during the early Cold War. What caught his attention was a sealed crate marked NIILM. Inside were 7 magnetic tapes, a stack of incident logs, and several aerial photographs of a structure that had once stood deep in the woods northeast of Bodomor, now reduced to little more than foundation scars. The photos were taken in late 1954 and bore the stamp of a now defunct Department of Defense division. One of the tapes was labeled Test A5, Subject 003, Isolation, 96 HRs. Kravitz had a working reel-to-reel at home. Over the next 2 nights, he listened. The recording was a controlled interview between a man identified only as Dr. Lenning and an unnamed test subject. The voice of the subject was quiet, occasionally shaking but articulate. The man described prolonged sensory isolation in a chamber located beneath the lower platform of the site, likely referring to the now vanished research station near Bodomor Lake. The goal of the experiment, according to the dialogue, was to study the effects of extended deprivation on cognitive perception. But the subject's statements grew stranger with each hour logged. "There's something in the dark," the man said during hour 43. "It watches when I breathe." By hour 61, I hear the same sentence over and over, but it's not in any language. It's being said inside my head, not spoken, folded. And then during the final hour, there's no wall anymore, only the idea of one. I think I've stepped out. The last 5 minutes of the tape were corrupted, a high-pitched distortion that Kravitz, with all his years in signal decoding, could not explain. Not tape damage, something else, a kind of interference he had never encountered. Disturbed, he contacted a former colleague in Minneapolis, but within days, Kravitz fell ill and was hospitalized with acute neurological symptoms. His health declined rapidly, and he died on November the 2nd. The tapes were never recovered from his home. The official cause of death was listed as cerebral hemorrhage. That winter, Freddie Walder disappeared again. This time, not into the woods, but from a private care facility on the outskirts of Boise. At exactly 4:32 in the morning on December the 10th, the night nurse entered his room and found the bed cold, the window open, and a trail of frost-covered footprints leading away from the building, barefoot, human, and ending abruptly 30 yards into the snow. No body was ever found, no tracks returned. The authorities declared it an escape and likely exposure death, but the staff insisted that all windows had been locked until moments before discovery. Several noted that Freddie had spoken little in recent weeks, though one orderly recalled him humming a single, unchanging note under his breath at night, a dull, droning tone, always the same pitch. By early spring of 1962, a man named Luther Beck entered the narrative. Beck was a former surveyor for the Department of the Interior, now living in isolation in North Dakota. He contacted a professor of folklore at the University of Minnesota, offering documents and field sketches dating back to the early 1940s. Among them was a map of the Bodomor region, dated 1941, showing a marked signal site almost exactly where Freddie had vanished 2 decades later. More interestingly, Beck's notes described phenomena long before the installation of any research facility. Sudden quiet, trees shifting position between visits, incomplete echoes, sense of being watched, sky over the ridge sometimes darker than surrounding area even at midday. One annotation stood out. Geometry resists mapping, angles shift at approach. That same phrase would later appear, word for word, in a confidential debriefing from a Forest Service surveyor dated July of 1963, over 20 years later. There were patterns forming, whispers among records, footprints in the snow that never returned, magnetic fields curling inward like claws. By the time authorities finally returned to Bodomor Lake with renewed interest in 1964, the original site of the old research facility had vanished beneath undergrowth and collapse. The concrete was cracked and overgrown. Only fragments remained, and one sealed metal door embedded in the rock rusted shut and partially buried. When workers attempted to cut it open, their tools failed. Electric saws malfunctioned. Generators cut out for no clear reason. Eventually, the operation was abandoned, and the records sealed once more. To this day, no official account explains what happened to Freddie Walder, nor has any institution taken public responsibility for the events at Bodomor Lake. But the hum is still there, in short-wave bands and faulty microphones, in the way compasses twitch near the ridge and the wind pauses without warning. And somewhere in the woods, a wall that was never built, never seen, still waits, invisible, but felt, like pressure behind the eyes. In the early weeks of May 1962, a cold spring clung stubbornly to the hills around Bodomor Lake. The trees, still stripped of their leaves, stood like silent sentinels over the mossy ruins where once there had been corridors of research, fences of secrecy, and a building now remembered by few and seen by fewer still. That month, a forest fire broke out 15 miles northeast of the lake. What began as a minor lightning ignition turned into a rapidly expanding burn, fed by unusually dry moss beds and a sudden shift in wind. Fire crews from Silver Bay and Grand Marais were dispatched, along with a detachment of Civilian Conservation Corps veterans. Among them was a man named Emery Lang. Lang was a fire control specialist, age 42, former reconnaissance photographer during the Second World War. He was practical, skeptical, and a man of routines. But on May 10th, during a perimeter check just before dusk, Lang claimed he witnessed something beyond rational understanding. He had separated from his team, following a strange funnel of smoke curling westward, not with the wind, but against it. At precisely 7:17 in the evening, according to his field notes, the noise around him abruptly ceased. Lang described a moment of stillness, so complete it felt sculpted, followed by a brief but disorienting visual distortion in the air approximately 30 feet ahead of him. What he saw next was described in his personal journal, later retrieved by his son. A man standing still in the forest, barefoot, facing away, dressed in a plain hospital gown, and muttering softly. Lang did not approach. He said he tried to call out, but his own voice came out flat, swallowed by the woods. The man eventually turned and looked directly at him, eyes wide open, but his face was otherwise slack, as if uninhabited. Lang fled. 2 days later, the fire perimeter had been secured. No human remains were discovered in the burn zone. Lang submitted his incident report, but excluded the sighting. He later told his son that he believed the figure had been Freddie Walder. Back in Duluth, the Minnesota State Hospital Board quietly began reviewing older patient files, particularly those from institutions between the years 1949 and 1957. This review had been triggered not by a psychiatric concern, but by a financial audit involving irregularities in federal funding for unclassified experimental care programs. Among the files was a red folder marked Patient 42C Temp Transfer to LM Site, May 54. No name, no discharge, no death certificate, just the notation, failure to reintegrate. The initials LM appeared again, the same designation found on documents recovered by Gregory Kravitz months earlier. The question of what had existed near Bodomor Lake between 1953 and 1956 and what it had been used for was becoming unavoidable. That summer, a reporter named Alice Embleton from the St. Paul Dispatch began a series of informal interviews with former government contractors across the Iron Range. She posed as a writer interested in Cold War fallout shelters, but her notes reveal a different interest altogether. One such interview, with a former electrical installer named Noah G. Mickelson, led to an off-the-record confession. Mickelson claimed that in the summer of 1955, he had been brought to a low-frequency monitoring station roughly 5 miles east of Bodomor Lake. He said the entire structure was underground. Concrete halls, sealed rooms, red lights that stayed on 24 hours a day. According to him, the facility had been focused not on detecting signals from outside, but on capturing leakage from inside. When pressed, he couldn't clarify. He did, however, recall a specific room they were instructed never to enter, labeled Chamber 12. It had 2 separate airlocks and a secondary power feed. Once, during a system failure, the corridor outside that chamber was flooded with a high-pitched whine. The engineers were told it was equipment stress. Mickelson didn't believe it. He quit the job shortly after, and his contract was dissolved. Embleton tried to publish her findings later that year. Her article, titled "The Lake That Wasn't Ours," was heavily redacted by her editor and never made it to print. She was laid off from the Dispatch in October. 2 years later, she died in a single-vehicle accident on an icy road near Eveleth. Her notes were boxed and stored in a private archive until rediscovered in the late 1990s. As the year 1962 progressed, a strange phenomenon began to emerge, not directly around the lake itself, but in surrounding towns. Between June and August, reports of lost time incidents increased. In Grand Marais, 2 fishermen claimed they had been on the water for 2 hours, yet their watches showed only 17 minutes had passed. In Toft, a woman named Marion Skelter reported waking up on the front steps of her home with a suitcase she didn't own. Filled with damp clothing and handwritten notes she could not remember writing. Each report was isolated, none severe enough to prompt official investigation, but all within a 35-mile radius of Bodomor. The common thread was unease. All subjects described a lingering sense of disconnection, headaches, or nausea. Most claimed to feel out of step for several days after the event, as though they were slightly behind everything that was happening around them. One final incident from that summer stands out. On August 22nd, a group of teenage boys hiking near the northern edge of the lake discovered what they believed to be an abandoned mine entrance, a low, rusted frame embedded in a hillside, partially hidden by brush. Inside was a narrow corridor lined with wooden beams, extending perhaps 50 feet before collapsing inward. One of the boys, identified in later interviews as Jonathan Lee, described seeing a light at the end of the shaft, just before it gave way. A pale blue glow, like a lantern behind frosted glass. The group returned the next day with a local guide, but the entrance was gone. No sign of the beams, no hollow in the earth, only a solid, unbroken slope. Jonathan became withdrawn afterward. His mother reported that he had begun carving repeating triangles into the wood of his bed frame, always 3 interlocking shapes, overlapping slightly. The same symbol later turned up in Ruth Danziger's field journal from the previous year. What that shape represented, coincidence, code, or something less explainable, no one knew. What was becoming clearer, however, was that whatever had occurred at Bodomor Lake was not over. If anything, it was growing, not like a fire, but like mold beneath wallpaper. Silent, expanding, waiting, and always in the background that hum, never heard directly, but always felt in the teeth. By the autumn of 1962, the Bodomor region had become something more than a quiet patch of forest at the northern edge of Minnesota. It was not yet famous, not named in the press, not mapped as anything but trees and water and trail. But among certain officials, field researchers, and forgotten veterans of disbanded agencies, it had acquired a quiet gravity, a kind of territorial warning. People didn't talk about Bodomor Lake anymore. They referred to it, vaguely, indirectly, in phrases like the Lake Project, or that ridge, or simply where it started. That October, a man named Howard L. Dillinger arrived in Ely under an assumed name. He was a former field technician with the Federal Radiological Monitoring Service. Between the years 1950 and 1959, he had been stationed at 3 different atmospheric sampling posts in the northern Midwest. Dillinger wasn't a scientist. He was a fixer, a man sent when equipment failed or went silent, especially when silence seemed to follow patterns. He had seen the Walder file, and he had seen something worse. He told his landlord, a retired Navy mechanic named Carl Remington, that he was tracking a pulse that shouldn't exist. According to Remington, Dillinger kept a leather-bound journal and a suitcase of charts, nearly all of them centered on geomagnetic readings from the period between 1953 and 1956. The focal point of every chart, the latitude and longitude of Bodomor Lake. On October the 21st, Dillinger hiked toward the lake alone. He was never seen again. 3 days later, a park ranger named Sylvia Barcroft located his backpack caught in the crook of a pine root near Turn Bluff. The journal was inside, water damaged but intact. Its last legible entry read, "The field isn't fixed, it bends when approached." That winter, the wind shifted, and not just in the forest. In early November, a confidential report passed across the desk of Colonel Irwin Keats at the Army Signal Intelligence Post in Fort Snelling. The report had been compiled by a network of university researchers working under the auspices of a grant officially related to auroral research. But buried in the document, under coded language and academic misdirection, was the assertion that certain locations across the continental United States were exhibiting persistent geophysical anomalies of a sustained, localized, non-random nature. 5 sites were highlighted. One of them was Bodomor Lake. The report didn't theorize cause. It focused on pattern. It showed years of data. Electromagnetic readings, radio interference, barometric distortion, even animal migration routes, all inconsistent with seasonal change, all pointing inward, as if something were drawing natural processes toward a single, invisible center. By the time the snow arrived in December, even the most skeptical minds in the Duluth district office had quietly begun removing Bodomor from camping pamphlets and seasonal trail maps. A blank spot was beginning to take shape. But what broke the silence was not a chart. It was a voice. On December 11th, just after midnight, a shortwave radio enthusiast named Harold Semmes in Thunder Bay recorded a 40-second burst of unexplained signal from what he believed was a test frequency used only by old military weather stations. It was a narrowband transmission, repeating patterns, then static. But beneath the static was speech, not modulated, not transmitted by voice, but present. Semmes played the recording for 3 separate linguists. One believed it to be a corrupted French dialect. Another described it as speech-like interference. The third refused to classify it at all, but noted a repeating structure, every 7th tone matching a phoneme used in native Athabascan languages, though the speaker's voice was identifiably male and slow. Each word slurred not by speech, but by distortion. The final 7 seconds of the transmission sent a chill through Semmes, because the voice repeated something twice. "He is not done." That phrase appeared days later in another context, scrawled on the side of a surveyor's aluminum case, found abandoned near East Trail Spur. No fingerprints, no human tracks, only the words, etched with a knife into the thin metal. "He is not done." By New Year's, 1963, there were whispers among Forest Patrol officers that the Bodomor sector was being unofficially avoided. Not out of protocol, but from a quiet, practiced intuition, the same way experienced woodsmen learn never to camp on a game trail or how to read a false calm before a storm. Something was off near the lake. It wasn't the way animals avoided the ridge, or how frost lingered longer in that valley than in others. It wasn't the magnetic pull or the strange resonance that made car radios hum as drivers passed mile marker 158. It was the feeling of memory being pulled backward. Those who spent too long near the lake, even brief visits, even silent walks, reported intense dreams for nights afterward. Dreams not of places they had been, but of versions of themselves watching themselves from across invisible glass. A man from Silver Bay claimed he saw his childhood home in perfect detail, but there were no people and the clocks had no hands. A woman from Duluth said she kept hearing her mother's voice, though her mother had died 17 years prior. None of this could be proven, but the pattern was repeating. Then came the frost fractures. In February of 1963, while drilling ice cores for climate data, a University of Minnesota glaciologist noted a perfectly circular fracture 5 feet below the surface of the lake's frozen western basin. The core shattered in a clean ring, not jagged but smooth, with a darkened center that seemed to contain nothing. When examined under magnification, the sample showed signs of crystalline deformation, as if the water had frozen around an absence, like an air pocket, but deeper, stranger. The sample was stored, and within 72 hours, the container itself burst in the freezer. The resulting hole in the sample chamber floor was 6 inches wide, and not from pressure or chemical reaction. No known substance had caused the break. It was simply absent, a column of wood, floor, insulation, all missing, as if neatly cut out by something that had never touched the material at all. One witness described it as a negative space. Not what was taken, he said, what was never there. By March, discussions had begun, unofficially, of sealing the Bodomor access roads. Not closing them permanently, but removing signage, adjusting routes, letting the forest grow back and the trailheads blur. It was the kind of bureaucratic vanishing act that required no signatures, only forgetfulness. But not everyone was willing to forget. One final note from this period remains: the handwritten testimony of Ellen Dorr, a school teacher from Two Harbors who had lost her husband to the forest in 1959. She submitted a letter to the county archive during the Bodomor Review hearings of 1984, which were later made public in part. In it, she wrote, "I do not claim my husband was taken. I do not know what happened, but for the last 3 years of his life, he never looked me in the eye again. He never answered directly. It was like he'd become a photograph of himself, and at night, when he thought I was asleep, he'd whisper to the wall the same thing, over and over. He is not done." In the spring of 1963, the forest began to dry. By late April, the last snowmelt had drained from the northern slopes, and sunlight crept again through the birches lining the narrow trail to Bodomor Lake. The land, for the first time in months, looked ordinary. Birds returned, small game reappeared. The breeze no longer held that strange tension. The silence that once choked the air had become merely quiet. For most, it was enough to believe the danger had passed. Whatever had occurred, whatever ripple had spread through the region, had sunk back into the soil. But for Freddie Walder, time had never restarted. He had been under observation at the North Shore Convalescence Center since his return, but in March, after a series of unresponsive episodes and several nights of intense somnambulism, Freddie was transferred to a state hospital in Moose Lake under a quiet emergency order. Officially, the diagnosis was transient psychogenic amnesia, complicated by trauma-induced disassociation. Unofficially, the doctors had no language for his condition. He spoke rarely, but he began to draw. Each sketch was a variation of the same thing: a flat surface, featureless, seamless, sometimes with a circle, sometimes with a vertical seam, always surrounded by markings he could not explain. Not symbols, not language. Just indentations, like pressure left in metal long after the machine has shut down. In early May, after nearly 2 months of observation, Freddie Walder disappeared a second time. The night nurse on duty swore she saw him asleep at 10:30. At midnight, he was gone. No forced entry, no broken windows. The door still locked from the inside. A single piece of paper was left on the floor beneath his bed. On it, in shaky pencil, 3 words: "Not outside yet." A week later, in Duluth, Gregory Kravitz received a package without return address. Inside were several photocopied documents, some partially burned, others stamped with the words "Restricted, LM Protocol." Among them, a typed report dated October 3rd, 1954, detailing a field experiment near Bodomor Lake involving non-rhythmic sensory isolation under low-frequency envelope resonance. The term was later removed from all public literature. The report described a procedure where subjects were placed in subterranean enclosures designed to cancel out all incoming sensory input. No sound, no light, no sense of movement. The experiment lasted between 8 and 12 hours for each volunteer. Only 2 completed the full duration. One of them was referred to only as Subject 9C. The other was a forestry worker. His name redacted, but his birth year and state matched exactly that of Freddie Walder. The final paragraph of the document included a sentence in all capitals. Subject describes interior state as static plane beyond time barrier. Subject says there was no direction, no light, and no death. Kravitz took the files to his supervisor at the university. They were dismissed as forged. The originals were never located. The box was confiscated the next day by 2 men who claimed to be from the Bureau of Land Management. Kravitz never saw them again. As the summer of 1963 unfolded, sightings around the Bodomor region became rarer, not because the events had stopped, but because no one was looking. Trails were closed under the pretense of fire damage. Survey projects were rerouted. The lake was quietly removed from maps printed after August. By fall, the forest had taken the rest. The old power lines were pulled. The gravel access roads were left to decay. Local guidebooks listed the area as unmaintained. And by the end of the decade, even that footnote disappeared. Yet the effects did not. In 1971, a group of geology students from the University of Manitoba, mapping glacial terrain, stumbled upon a patch of forest where their compass needles spun freely for 17 seconds before correcting. Their instruments picked up a low hum, only detectable within a 100-foot radius, before vanishing entirely. They left without camping. In 1980, a cross-country skier vanished near Trail Fork 6. His final recorded words, left on a cassette journal he kept for his wife, were, "I saw my shadow walk away." In 1994, a storm system moved over the region and stalled for 3 hours. No satellite could capture its shape. The rain fell, not in sheets but in pulses, and then, just as quickly, it ended. By then, Bodomor had been forgotten. But in the attic of a farmhouse in Iron, Minnesota, one last artifact remained. A box labeled "Property of Freddie Walder." Inside, among the photographs and yellowed documents, was a sealed envelope marked "For After." It was opened by a distant nephew, years later, who gave it to a local historian. It contained a single audio reel dated 1965, with no label. The contents were preserved. 48 seconds of silence. Then a voice. Freddie's voice. "I was not returned. I was moved." You think it was a wall. It was not a wall. It was the shape of not being. I went behind. A pause. Breathing. There is no time in there, but time remembers you. It wants you back. Not to harm you, just to finish. The tape ends with static. But if slowed and reversed, audio engineers later claimed there was one more phrase. Distorted, but present. He is still there. That phrase, "still there," appears in 3 other sources across 4 decades, none linked to Freddie Walder. One in a journal, one in a park ranger's audio log, one scratched into a rock face near what used to be Chamber 12. To this day, Bodomor Lake remains unmarked. The trail no longer exists. The documents are sealed or lost, the recordings unverified, and the only photograph of Freddie Walder after his return is a grainy, unfocused black and white taken from across the hospital lawn. He is standing beside a tree, staring at nothing, not blinking, and his shadow is pointing the wrong way.